When we think of the role of words or vocabulary in learning, the point that I want to make today is that knowledge is at the center of who we are at the present time. We're in a knowledge culture, and knowledge is represented by words. And the thing about vocabulary learning is it's not separate from the constructs or domains that you're teaching and students are learning. So let's take a look here at a representation, a very crude representation of the knowledge that's available on the internet. And I think that the blue shape could probably encompass the whole room that I'm sitting in. But the point that I want to make is that we've never before been in a world where we have so much access to information. Now, some of this information might be dubious, and that's actually part of what we're teaching students in school, is how to sift through that information. But the point is that the knowledge of humankind is and has been curated on the internet. And a critical point here is that the reason reading is so important is that knowledge is stored in text. Now, while it's true that we have DVDs and movies, the point is that except for some of those strange cat videos, DVDs and movies start out as scripts. So they start out as texts and they get made into different kinds of forms. Okay, so at the center of our knowledge are words. And it typically turns out that texts have many more rare words than even a conversation between two college-educated people. Okay, so the ways in which we typically speak, even the ways I'm speaking now, and it turns out that in presentations, the genre or the vocabulary is more sophisticated than in typical conversations between friends. But even a text that you might read to a very young child, like Very Hungry Caterpillar, has more rare words typically than the conversations between adults, including college-educated ones. So the point is that knowledge resides in text, and the ways in which we represent that is through words. And my underlying theme today isn't that these words get treated separately. You know, we teach the kids the definitions and then we teach the content. What I want to demonstrate is that these labels, the ideas, are central to students' understanding of the content. So let's take a look at features of vocabulary in social studies texts. And I want to make a couple of points, actually 5 points about how vocabulary looks in social studies texts. And it turns out that this is actually quite different than how vocabulary looks in stories or narratives. Okay, one of the things, if we look at a text like this, creating the Constitution, and if you quickly scan over that, I want to make a couple of points about the ideas in this text. One is that the vocabulary represents connected ideas. Okay. So just teaching kids the concept of the Constitutional Convention or the concept of federal, it needs to be grounded within the content. And these semantic maps, where we have the key ideas, can be an excellent way for students to understand how these ideas connect with each other. So if I were asking students to simply learn the word compromise without understanding what it was the delegates needed to do at the Constitutional Convention, that word doesn't have a lot of meaning. Okay? These words like checks and balances, separation of powers, these words become meaningful in the context of these other ideas. Now, what you see in this particular, and this is from a civics topic, what you're seeing here, or political science, is you're seeing a lot of quite formal terms, like Bill of Rights, U.S. Constitution. And one of the points that I'm going to make is that we see different kinds of vocabulary in different areas of social studies. But in all cases, the ideas are connected. And for me to understand how the branches of government work, the legislative, executive, and judicial, it's really, I learn more about those systems as I learn about the checks and balances and the separation of powers. So these ideas aren't discombobulated or disconnected from one another. Vocabulary represents the ideas, and those ideas are connected to each other. A second idea about the vocabulary in social studies, which is very, very different than narratives or stories, and it happens to some degree in science, but social studies is the area in which this phenomenon is the greatest. And that is that concepts, many concepts, are represented by phrases. In an analysis of words on the different standards in social studies, Bob Marzano found that about 40% of the vocabulary actually were these phrases. Now, if we were in German, and keep remembering English has a German base, and then over that, we have a French vocabulary because of the history of Great Britain. So we have words like checks, that would be a Germanic word, and a word like bill and rights. But words like separation and confederation have French origins. But the point here is that in German, in the language from which we originated, English, these words would often be concatenated. They would be put together. But that's not the case anymore. So we actually need to create awareness with students that there's a concept here that's represented by a phrase. So separation and powers can't be separated, right? It's one notion. And that's very different than what students have come to expect when they've been taught vocabulary in English language arts. There are very few of these complex phrases that are used in narrative text. So this is a very new idea as you're getting into content in your text, especially social studies. Even in mathematics, you don't see a lot of that. Sometimes you do, but not to the degree that you do in social studies. And keep remembering that in English, we don't stick those words together. So in German, for example, for House of Representatives, you'd have one big long word, or for water cycle, you'd have one big long word. That's not the case in English. The third idea is that at least in some parts of social studies content, there are a lot of names. And in fact, the names are part and critical to the content. So this is another section to that Constitutional Convention piece that I was showing you, or the creation of the Constitution, that we have lots and lots of different names. In geography, we'll have lots of proper names of places. So this is an important thing to think about. Which names are really critical for students to understand? And keep remembering, names are different than other words in the language. Even though the name James originally had some meaning. That's not how we see it at this point. So for example, the word Detroit means straight in French, S-T-R-A-I-T, but it's not semantically viewed that way in the United States. Okay, so names don't have the same meaning base, nor do they have the morphological families that are the case with other words. So for example, the word opposed in the short paragraph here with Patrick Henry, opposed and opposition and opposite, those are all parts of a family of words that have similar kinds of meanings, or defense and defendant, or argue and argument, or independent and independence, or refuse and refusal, or attend and attendance. Okay, but that's not the case with names. So that creates a whole set of challenges for students, especially if you come with languages other than English to reading these texts. The fourth point is that academic texts include a special register of words. These are called general academic words. Now, there's much more awareness of this register of words than there was 20 or 25 years ago. So people like Catherine Snow have programs like Word Generation. And in programs, if you're using a social studies program, it's likely that they're calling out particular words. But these words are ubiquitous, and they're very abstract in the main, which means that unlike, for example, the word revolution, or even a word like delegate, where you can kind of form a picture of somebody, a word like therefore isn't something that you can put a concrete image to. Now, the good news about these words is that these are the words, in fact, that are typically from the French layer of English, and they often have a number of morphological relatives in their family. So form, formation, complete, completely, completion, create, creation. So it turns out kids actually encounter these words a lot more frequently than we might think they do. But because of their abstractness, and because typically, in this case, it would be Declaration of Independence and delegates, and then we've got Philadelphia here, where there's a proper word, and ideals and laws and so on, they typically aren't the words that we're really concerned about in terms of the content. So very few of these words, for example, were on this example here that I showed you. Some of them are academic words, but in the main, these are what we would distinguish as content words. A word like system or including falls into that group of general academic words. But I'm saying that there's actually a whole different kind of language. And it's a very different language than the language that's used in narrative text. Okay, the other thing is that we need to be cognizant that when we move between, for example, geography, and we move to history, or we move to civics, there are going to be some differences in both, obviously, the specific vocabulary, but also in terms of the nature of the vocabulary. So let's take a look at, this is from a primary level text about maps, okay? And what you're seeing here is you don't see, at least in this particular one, aren't seeing a lot of place names, and in this case you aren't actually even seeing as many of the phrases. There are some, like absolute location and relative location and compass rose, but there are also lots of words here that have to do with, like grid and key and so on, that are actually single words that are important to have the concept. But do you see how I've, again, put the words in a place, so it's not just learning the word legend or compass rose, it's learning these words in relation to each other. Okay, so as I learn more about the grid, then it gives me some meaning for the word legend. And as I learn about maps, I also learn something about directions and absolute location. Here's an example of a text in middle grades around history, okay, the kingdoms of Egypt. And in this case, the vocabulary here, you see a lot of it's repetitive, okay, like the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom, Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt. They're very different kinds of concepts than we were seeing in civics, where we were talking about documents, about some things that were very, very abstract. Now, these periods of time maybe are abstract for kids, but we can actually associate them with something fairly concrete, like during the New Kingdom, there was the conquering of new lands, for example. Okay, so those are the distinctions that I'm making, that regardless of the content area, we want to support students in seeing how these ideas represented by words, some people call that vocabulary. See, I'm saying that vocabulary is the essence of the content. In social studies, science, mathematics, or whatever it is that you're reading or learning about, the ideas are represented by words. And it really is helpful to see how these ideas connect to each other. In this case, you know, the idea of a kingdom is going to help you parse these different periods of time. But the ideas of, for example, prosperity and the Nile flooding and conquering lands are reasons or hallmarks of these periods of time, but they aren't going to be connected in the same way that we saw, for example, with the words related to maps. So the parts of maps all relate to one another, and as you learn about one part, you're actually getting better at some of the other ideas. So what are the instructional supports? The first instructional support is that these vocabulary maps that I've been showing are really critical to help students organize the fundamental ideas related to content. And as well as classes led by the teacher, making vocabulary maps is a great thing. I'm suggesting that encouraging students to generate their own maps is a very, very critical activity. So here are some examples of some maps of topics that I've been working on. This one actually relates to STEM, but it might be something that we talk about also in various topics of geography and even in history, like the Middle Ages, about bridges. We want to talk about buildings, about how architecture and engineering, for example, occur or are related to one another. And what I'm trying to show here is that there aren't right answers to these maps, but it's a way in which we can parse the critical vocabulary, and we can look to see how ideas connect with each other. What you're always seeing is that at one point or another, I, as the creator of this map, the person who's organizing the knowledge, either as a student or as a teacher, am putting some kind of a frame on it. So we've got nodes, you know, big ideas like the modern monuments in Middle Ages and ancient ones. And then from those, we start developing subsidiary ideas. Okay, and as you see, in an area such as this, where we're tabulating things, this map looks a lot like the one in history, okay, where we're giving reasons, and it's different than some of the connections that we saw in the Constitutional Congress. A second idea is use pictures and illustrations whenever possible. Often when you're using a program, there'll be some really great pictures in the text. And those have been put there very purposefully to help students put some kind of an anchor, a link to an image. And I'm suggesting that these pictures of the buildings that house the executive, legislative, and judicial systems of the United States are a really very concrete way of understanding the Constitution. Now, I don't believe that I actually put in a picture here to let you know that at TextProject, and I will give you a reference for that at the end, but at TextProject, we've got about 600 or 700 pictures that are tagged to particular concepts. And those are all for free download, especially for students who come from different cultures and speak different languages. The use of pictures can be very critical to anchor ideas for students. Here are some other examples. So I'm just saying, to the degree possible, making part of these maps, these idea maps, concrete can be really, really critical. Here's another example where, we're now showing something that was built in the Middle Kingdom, this canal system, helping students actually anchor some of their ideas. And they will probably know about mummies and pharaohs, but it was actually the pharaoh and a line of pharaohs, right? Their dynasties that ran through these different kingdoms, and that's an important thing to know about. So the second point is use the illustrations in the text. Use illustrations that you can find at places like TextProject. If there are video clips and so on that come along with programs, these are really important to make what can often be very abstract ideas more concrete. The third point is, I think this is really critical as someone who is fascinated by history, and I actually was a history major as an undergraduate. I happen to have an incredible memory for names, but everybody doesn't. And what I'm going to suggest is, often when we read books, some of our authors or editors have had a hard time deciding really what they want to focus, what's like the most critical thing that you can focus on. And I'm going to suggest that sometimes there's just an overabundance of proper names. And what I'm suggesting is make sure that you have some sense of what's actually central to the concepts that you're trying to teach. And as I'm showing here, bringing in illustrations of some of these people or pictures of places or something to make it very concrete, as I was doing with, for example, this canal system or a pharaoh. These are really important things to do because names can be very hard to remember. They don't fit into our morphological families like focus and critical and choose and group, which brings us to the fourth idea. One of the things that I talk a lot about are collections in classrooms of particular kinds of words. Some of these collections might be around the ideas, as is the case with, for example, one of these maps. But another thing that we can do is have students collect academic families and the words within them. And these are some examples of some of the academic families that are critical in this program, or excuse me, in the text that I've shown you. So one of the really important things to understand about the academic words is that it's very rare that a general academic word just lives by itself. Most general academic words have a whole group of words around them, a morphological family. And it's important for kids to have an awareness of that. Now, sometimes, as you see with explanation, the spelling of words changes, or achievable, or creature and creative. So there can be some changes that make it hard to recognize where, the relationships between the words. One of the things that I'm not talking about today that I've done a considerable amount of work on is many of these words come from the French layer of English, and for students who speak Spanish, they actually have a leg up in using many of these words as common words in their language, in Spanish. The issue, again, is that in Spanish, the pronunciation is different. And keep remembering that spelling changes in the case of some of these families. But getting the sense that you know a lot about these words is a really important idea for students. So it's not that we're just like learning each of these words separately. Creation is separate from create, which is separate from creature. These words have something in common, and that's an important thing to know about. Finally, and I apologize there for my title going off the screen, but encourage students to read topic-related articles in magazines. We have a generation of students, especially in the middle grades and in middle school, who aren't doing that much reading on their own. And I'm not meaning like they're reading after school. What I'm actually saying is a lot of the reading that's happening in classrooms, and we've recently had a study done of 7th through 12th grade classrooms, social studies and English language arts, done at the University of Texas as part of the Reading for Understanding project. What that study found is that a decent amount of time was devoted to reading in these classrooms from grades 7 to 12. About 10 minutes a day in ELA, in English language arts, and about 14 minutes in social studies. But 80% of the time spent reading actually was done through listening to someone read. So only 20% of that time actually had students reading on their own. So we've come to a point where when the texts are perceived as being harder, that teachers, audio readers, other students in the class, even reading the text together has become very common. And what we need to do is to get kids to take responsibility for their own reading. And a great way to do that is to have them read in topic-related articles in magazines. The thing about a magazine article is that it's pretty self-contained. And it also, to a student, looks like it's doable. Now, if you're in high school, there are lots of places on the internet where you can find some of these articles. If you're in elementary and in middle school, sometimes it's a little bit harder. But ReadWorks has approximately 3,000 free passages, many of them on topics relevant to social studies instruction. Here's some examples on the topic of ancient buildings. And as you take a look at, for example, the one on the left, what you see is that, although I've kind of run some of the text off the page, what you're seeing is that there's something here that's self-contained and that you can look at and think, I can do that. That's something that's doable. And as a teacher, I can help parse some of the paragraphs for the kids who haven't been doing a lot of the reading on their own. But what I'm suggesting here is that this can be a really important way to help engage students in the content and also to expand their knowledge related to the content. So if we read some articles on pharaohs and mummies and canal systems and the Nile, for example, we can embellish the background we have when we read a chapter or a summary of text related to that topic. So these are some of the examples from readworks.org. And as I said, these are all open access, which means that you can download them. They have comprehension questions. So this is a resource, and I'm showing you things that are around the 3rd to 5th grade levels, but they have texts that cover all the way through high school, including some excellent resources from museums and art institutions around the country. So I really encourage you to check that out. Okay, in summary, what I've talked about then is I've talked about the unique aspect of social studies vocabulary. But in particular, and it's unique in that there are lots of phrases, often there are lots of proper nouns, proper names in text. I also talked about the fact that there is general academic vocabulary that's often abstract and can be pretty heavy in its content. But the point that I've been making is that the ideas are represented by words, vocabulary, and that vocabulary is really critical to understand, not through definitions, but as ways to summarize the ideas and the connections across the topics. And as I learn more about checks and balances, for example, I learn more about what the distinctive roles are of the legislative, executive, and judicial committees. I then said that there are ways to provide instructional supports. I think just a fabulous thing for kids to be doing are to be organizing the big ideas. That is, the words, the vocabulary around a topic in these maps as I've been showing you today. I also talked about using, whenever possible, pictures. There's a reservoir of pictures at TextProject. And if you go onto the TextProject website, it'll be under classroom materials. We've got word pictures there. We've also got a set of magazine articles, not as abundant as the ones at ReadWorks, but we have some. I also talked about making sure that we choose which of the place names or proper names we're going to emphasize in our content. Let's make sure that those are ones that we really want kids to focus on as central to the content that we're teaching. I also talked about having kids collect sets of morphological families around the general academic vocabulary. Why? We want them to see that particular words that always are there, they're ubiquitous, but they actually have numerous members in their families that share a basic meaning. And then finally, I talked about the need to help kids develop a broad background knowledge related to ideas that they're studying, and that magazine articles can be really great for doing that. This is the homepage of TextProject, the not-for-profit that I run, and as you can see here, we've got lots of different classroom materials. We've got lots of materials for professionals, for professional learning and development, including a set of videotapes at YouTube, of which this particular presentation will become a part of. So Trevor, if there's some questions now, I'm really happy to answer some.
Yeah, Dr. Hebert, there was quite a few. One in particular, it's very specific, but in terms of students collecting the academic words and the word families, do you have recommended ways to do that, or graphic organizers, or handouts, or what's your recommendation on how we house that material for the students to use?
Well, I talk a lot about collections of words, and in some classrooms there are whiteboards. I mean, I hope that kids have, in schools where kids have their own notebooks or Chromes or whatever, that there is a place where they can have a portfolio where they can actually collect some of this material. I think it's a great thing to have kids use sticky notes on chart paper or on boards where they put some of these, some of the things that they've identified. We might have once a week, a short session that talks about these academic words. One of the questions is, where can you find these families, the ones that are especially critical? And that also is on our website in the classroom materials. We have a section on lists. So I think that that's an important thing. Keep remembering that there are different words that are important at different ages. So from my perspective, there are some ways. Obviously, I have a program that helps me build these maps, and there are a couple of really good map building programs, but you can also sketch them out. But I think there needs to be a place where students can continue to add to their expand their repertoire. So what is it that I've learned, and to begin realizing as a student that I really, I learned that word explain. We talk about explanation a lot, but once I know that word, there are actually a whole set of other words that I know around it. And I have a lot more capability as a reader than I thought I did. So that's one of the things that I'm trying to do here with these ideas, is to actually keep some memory, in terms of the maps. So is there, do I have some map making, programs or whatever on the website? We don't have that, but I think, as you can see with the ones that I've been making here, they can take lots of different forms, and they can also be freehand.
All right, excellent. Yeah, no, thank you. And there was also another question in terms of focusing on groups of names, groups of people, and proper names. What do we do in social studies and history when names or places have multiple names or meanings? And what are your recommendations for some of that?
Now, I need to have an understanding here where a name has multiple meaning, because typically, a name.
Yeah, sorry, I meant a place had multiple names. I misread that. I apologize.
Oh, you mean
Yeah, like
like,
a location has multiple names and different names according to different cultures or people or
got it.
time periods.
Yeah, I would think that just like I've mapped out ideas here, if you're thinking of, you could easily map out what, St. Petersburg, what that came to be called, and when it changed back or whatever. What the point that I'm trying to make is, when I do a lot of writing of text for students, I use informational text a lot for the work I do in helping struggling readers. And why do I do that? Because it turns out in informational text, the really important words get repeated. Okay, so if you look at one of these texts, for example, about Egypt, you see the word Egypt is repeated a lot. We would also expect that, and authors don't look for a synonym for that word. But at the same, in literature, in teaching kids vocabulary in English language arts, it turns out we really do it by synonyms, because a good writer, doesn't keep repeating the same word like glitter over and over again. The Emerald City was glittering, it was dazzling, it was shimmering. But in informational text, you're not looking for a synonym for Egypt or history or kingdom. So some of these words are repeated a lot, and that's really, really good. What happens is, what do you do when, for example, Alexander the Great appears once in this section, or at one point you also have the first pharaoh is named here somewhere. Okay, so that happens one time. I think as teachers, and I work with writers, to do some thinking like, what's really critical to include? And is it really critical that you know all of the names, of these people in terms of the Constitutional Convention? Well, maybe over time it's critical to know all of the names, by the time you're in college. But the question is, if I could only teach particular ones, which ones would I choose? So what I'm talking about is sometimes I think we try to do everything and really lose the overall goal, that kids leave really not knowing much of anything. So I happen to think that Alexander Hamilton is great, and I guess I share that with Miranda, right? Lin-Manuel Miranda, who's done the Broadway show on Hamilton. But I'm just saying, as a first round at this particular level, are there some people that I really want to focus on that might not, I can't do it all, is what I'm saying. And I think that's an important thing to think about.
Yes, thank you. That was great. Um, really good explanation. There are not many more questions, so if you'd like to wrap it up, that's fine. That's great. It's a
Okay,
great film.
so in summary, I mean, the point that I have here today is a fairly simple one. And that idea is that vocabulary is the content. And it's not about defining particular words and then just learning the definitions. What it is about seeing how those words, how delegate or federal system relates to the overall content and theme. And as we look at these ideas and as we begin to, burrow down, get further and further into the meanings of some of these ideas, we get a better understanding of what happened, for example, at the Constitutional Convention, why that's worth remembering. So I actually found, and like I said, I'm a student of history, and it actually helped me a lot to just make this particular map of understanding how, the relationship with the Articles of Confederation, the U.S. Constitution. So I'm just saying, I think these ideas, and for kids to have these maps, can be a really critical thing, something that they actually retain and can revisit, because these are important ideas. These are ideas worth knowing. So thank you very much for your time today, and I hope you'll visit us at textproject.org, where everything is open access. Thank you very much.
Thank you so